Hello everyone and welcome to Daryo. Today we're tackling crucial topics that shapes our everyday life. Urbanization and infrastructure in Uzbekistan. So today we explore the topic of urbanization with our distinguished and esteemed guests. Dr. Monika Parrinder, Central St. Martin's, University of the Arts at London, Dr. Harriet Harriss from Pratt Institute at New York, Naomi House from Middlesex University, also at London. So my first question will be, what do you think of today's Uzbekistan? What aspects bring you joy and what do you feel is lacking?
I can start. On first impressions, two things arriving. The sense of community and what feels like a genuine mix of cultures. And I know that has a long history here, so it's very embedded, going back a millennia. And then how that impacts on a layered and changing urban fabric. But obviously that's changing very fast today. And that's why we're here. And then my second one is a very proud tradition of 20th century female architects. The first building we came across was by a female architect, and I am going to quote her name. So Ophelia, and she, you have the long tradition of female architects, and in a way that's very exciting because we're here to talk about female architecture in the mix of urban planning for future.
And for me, and thank you for the question, I think it's recognising that the region has in many ways retained much of its original identity and culture. It's seen shifts historically that have allowed influences to permeate the design of the cities and the aesthetics of buildings and spaces, but at the same time it is distinct within the region. I also think that it's economically, culturally and socially really well positioned to lead the region. Central Asia needs a hub of some sort, a centre where there is support for innovation, where a blueprint such as a master plan can be tested, that could be deployed across multiple cities within the country but also across Central Asia. And also that we see, as mentioned by my colleague, women architects taking a leading role in some of the reimagining, envisioning and delivery of those master plans and new spaces.
I think going to think about this from the perspective of being both obviously a tourist. You know, this is my first time in Uzbekistan and first time in Tashkent. I've travelled in Asia before, in South Asia and Southeast Asia, but not for a number of years. And that kind of sensory overload that you get when you visit a city, I find absolutely thrilling, but at times really overwhelming. So the kind of first things you notice are always the noise, the traffic, the smell. But as Monika's already talked about, we got here a little bit before Harriet and we ventured out into the streets outside the hotel, just did a little kind of flaneur, if you like, a sort of mini derive, a wander about. And that's when we encountered the housing block that we could see that was very near the hotel, and we could see it across the street, and we kind of aimed straight forward, and we're kind of instantly in this kind of other world where you could hear all the kind of sounds of children playing in the space. So you're kind of moving between that sense of the kind of overwhelm to the intimacy of the city, and that's very exciting.
As far as I know, you have spent a couple of days in Tashkent. So what is, in your opinion, distinguish Tashkent from other cities in terms of urbanization, infrastructure? So from your personal experience.
Well, first of all, I'm aware that you have a 2045 master plan for Tashkent city. And it's very interesting because from what I've read and understood, not just from observations, but reading the newspaper to see what matters to the people here, there's a real concern for better infrastructure. But I think what we need to understand, the infrastructure is threefold. It's things like roads and the safety of roads and the noise and the traffic. It's also about cultural heritage. And also, more importantly, perhaps, it's about ecological heritage as well. So in the United States right now, there is a big preoccupation with what we call the Green New Deal, understanding that a vast investment infrastructure needs to include sustainable energy and sustainable environments. So at the moment within the master plan is an ambition, and this is really with respect to President Mirziyoyev's ideas, and so I'm really impressed by his thinking, that what he's saying is that the 7-hectare greenbelt that you have in the city should be expanded to 25,000 hectares. 7,000 hectares. Greenbelt is going to be expanded to 25,000 hectares. And that is a global level thinking approach. So I think that the possibility here is that, again, this city can be a blueprint not just for the country and the region, but globally too. Because without a sustainable ecology, you can't have a sustainable city. Without enough trees to absorb the carbon produced by manufacturing, construction, and also road pollution, you can't have a place that's desirable to live. So it's not just about retaining the talent from the many universities here that produce high-level graduates, it's about attracting global talent to want to live here. And so there has to be a balance between expansion and growth, but also expansion and growth that creates places that are desirable to live, to raise children, to live, work and play safely and well. So those priorities are really key. Secondly, while we talk about a 2045 plan, there needs to be more interim deliverables. And what I mean by that is we can't wait till 2045 for these ambitions to be realised. They need to be realised now, incrementally, as a series of events over the next 20 years, because it will be too late in 25 years or 20 years for these things to be realised. And I think that speaks to the need to involve the public through a consultation process in envisioning what the city could look like. One of the most interesting things about Tashkent is that it has already a massive amount of assets, cultural, ecological, social, and as Naomi spoke to, this idea of this melting pot of identities and cultures. So it has a lot of resources to leverage. So this plan needs to strengthen what it is already good about the city and then be very discerning about what it brings in, because there needs to be a balance. And one last point to make is that we don't have often, we think of growth, infrastructure, transformation, about newness, about the building of new things. And what we've read and understood from the public is they don't want everything to be new. They value their cultural heritage here. So that leads us into a bigger conversation about adaptive reuse, using the assets we have already within the city and thinking about how we make them more livable, more energy efficient and so on. And that needs to be part of the conversation too about the future.
One of the assets that you have, of course, is this incredibly important resource of young architects. So Tatmina Terdileva, who invited us here to speak at the Urban Forum for Central Asia, she's headed up and set up, co-founded, the Organisation for Young Architects of Uzbekistan. And I think as well, Arzel Yasanova, one of the architects from Kazakhstan, she set up Urban Forum Almaty. And what's key here is that there's the voice of young architects who have, it's not about having new ideas that erase the last ones, but it's about having a more inclusive conversation where this asset of young architects can be part of mediating the conversations between the old architectural cultures, government cultures, and residents.
I think part of your question, and I've possibly forgotten it, was to do with how Tashkent might compare to other cities.
Yes.
I'm a Londoner, as is Monika, and Harriet, when she's not in the States, is a Londoner as well. And in many ways, there's clearly a lot of similarity. They're both kind of big cities. They're both capital cities, so they have a kind of responsibility for carrying the identity of a nation in a way. But I think, certainly the observation about the infrastructure in terms of what's very visible is that the car is, dominant. There is no kind of equality of access to the city, it's very much so. Tatmina has driven us around Tashkent, so we've actually seen quite a lot. But that's all facilitated by getting in a car. And clearly that means that there is a certain sort of ease in that, but it creates a very kind of difficult space for people just to kind of live in, and you have to move away, obviously from those arterial and circular routes in
For
order
instance,
to really
the housing unit
experience it.
that we were talking
That was
about,
quite hard to get to.
Yeah, we had to cross 6 lanes of traffic to get there.
At least there was a pedestrian crossing sign, because we've just been to Samarkand and had to cross about 6 lanes of traffic moving at high speed in the dark in order to just go and buy a bottle of water. And that seems a little crazy.
I agree, a bit difficult. But as a person who has lived in Uzbekistan almost my entire life, I've seen the country grow so rapidly. The development is impressive, the new buildings are rising everywhere. But the thing is that everything comes at a cost. So in our case, it's our tree-lined streets, which are disappearing. They are being replaced with the construction sites. Our trees, which are vital for oxygen, for cooling, they are just being cut down. Given the fact that the construction industry actually contributes to 40% of the global carbon dioxide emissions, like how we can balance the development of our country, and the environmental sustainability, because it feels like our progress leads us toward an environmental crisis, in fact.
Well, I think I want to start with, we're already in an environmental crisis. We're not heading there. So taking with that in mind, all future development conversations have to start from that point, that we're not even mitigating, we have to regenerate the cities. I think for me there's 2 points here. One is that a lot of the greening of cities in the past have been based on what we see as quite a colonial vision of beautiful lawns. There's something about power there, and also resources, because so much water is taken to keep those lawns green. So it feels to me that, yes, for greening the cities, but creating cities that, and buildings, and at every scale, that kind of embed greenery. I think they've got to be things that may be more indigenous, maybe ones that are what's the word, when you don't need watering, drought resistant, so that we don't green our cities, but then add to the water crisis, which will be the biggest crisis. And I think the other thing, because you mentioned the role of trees for, cooling, I think that's got to become infrastructural to the architecture. So when we've been walking around Tashkent, a lot of the architecture, the lattice work over the windows to create cooling, a lot of the mosques in Samarkand, the perforated walls which create a kind of passive cooling, and a lot of interior courtyards. I think those ideas that have been here for a long time need to be brought forward into new development. So in a way, the takeaway is about mixing low-tech indigenous and local knowledge with high-tech development.
And why that was actually like a concern, because last year I remember there were a lot of talks that like our government is going to transform Tashkent to the second Dubai, but everyone were like, why to transform the city to the second Dubai when we are green and beautiful?
Yeah, and I've also noticed there's a lot of the fake grass. Get rid of the fake grass, guys.
I mean, the other thing is, I don't know whether there's any kind of infrastructure around recycling. We have noticed that bins allow you in the street, do allow you to sort of sort your waste, but we spent 2 nights in a hotel in Samarkand, and our kind of carbon footprint just in the plastic left in the room just from the water that we're drinking was horrific. So there is a kind of...
We are taking responsibility there.
And we kind of, that kind of sense of...
So we're the visitors coming, and
really
there's no
adding
system
to
for us to fit into.
Or at least we don't understand what that system or infrastructure is to
so
kind of
the more
reuse.
tourism, the bigger those problems will be.
I agree, but the thing is that we do not have even that lot amount of trash bins on the streets, so people just throwing the garbage wherever they want. Of course, we have, trash bins, but for example, there is a long distance between them, so people just are exhausted carrying garbage with them, and they decide to throw it wherever they want. I know that there is like a penalties, they can be fined, but I have never ever heard such a case that someone was fined because of throwing the garbage somewhere.
So infrastructure needs to be thought more widely in terms of rubbish collection as well as greenery, etc.
Maybe some laws and regulations in terms of stricter penalties, because citizens also need to take responsibilities for throwing the garbage.
So we need to understand, it's really important just to zoom out for a minute and understand that infrastructure isn't about localised problems always, like just understanding the problem of recycling. It's where recycling sits in a bigger ecology of ideas for a city. That's what a master plan is. And frankly, it should be called a mistress plan, because some of the most talented and capable people in Tashkent right now positioned to deal with this problem are the women architects and not the men necessarily. So I think it's important to understand that we need to look at what the future trends analysts are saying about the climate crisis that, as Monika correctly pointed out, is already happening. It's just that in some regions, people are experiencing it more acutely than it's being felt here. Maybe a way to think of it is like this, that this year was the hottest on record, but also the coolest we will ever have again. So in some ways, being able to flip the way we perceive the situation we're in is a way of recognising just how bad it's going to get. So what do we know? We know that cities need to become more autonomous in terms of energy, food supply and water, as Monika pointed out. So those strategies are key. The other thing is, in the way that localised developments are happening, it's not that necessarily new buildings need to be built. It's actually that there was many that were unfinished and there was no activity on building sites. So this comes back to the idea of working with what you have in terms of your building stock, thinking about adaptive reuse, thinking about working to complete these half-finished projects, not continuing to build new things just because newness is perceived as a solution. Because actually sometimes it's going back to the traditions that are more sustainable than necessarily bringing in the new technologies and new innovations. What's worked well for centuries is established intelligence. Innovation is a risk game. We don't know whether it's going to work. When we position ourselves all the time on the frontier of innovation, we're taking big gambles, not just with the economics and the cost of innovation, but also our lives technically, because unless we can feed ourselves, drink fresh water, irrigate our farms, irrigate our trees, create places that are livable, then we don't have a future as a city. And also, finally, we often look to the West for solutions. You know, we look at America right now, and there are lots of cities that are crumbling, right? Infrastructure is not a priority. If you look east, Singapore right now, every single road is made out of recycled bottles, plastic bottles. There is innovation happening, and it isn't always about looking west. So there's an interesting thing here just to be reminded of. This is Central Asia. There is an opportunity for this country to really position itself as this hub of innovation, to connect ideas within the West and the East and then bring them together and amalgamate them, synthesize them and be propositional in ways that don't just impact this region, but potentially countries across the globe.
Our citizens are increasingly concerned with the fate of our 20th century architecture, because the demolition of historical buildings in favor of residential and office developments reveal a troubling trend. Even attempts to recreate these structures often fail to capture their original essence, resulting in significant loss of our cultural heritage. So the key question is how we can modernize without losing our country's soul. What innovative solutions can maybe help Uzbekistan urban growth with preserving its historical heritage?
I don't think it's about trying to preserve those buildings as monuments. Or to leave them to kind of ruination, so that that it's very appealing to us with our kind of architectural eyes, with those kind of spectacles on, to really kind of be able to sort of see them as the kind of romantic follies, as something that speak poetically to us as things that no longer need to have anything other than some form of aesthetic value. I think potentially the way through strategies of reuse is to bring those buildings into the modern day, is to begin to give them new uses or to experiment with introducing hybridity of use, to think about, well, what was this building built for, and can that use, does that use still have meaning and value? Can we bring that forward into the present day? Can we plug in other forms of use in order to make that more relevant to an pre-existing kind of community or the wider urban community? And that means that you can begin to reimagine these buildings potentially as both, maybe sort of residential space, but plugging back in things like healthcare facilities or education facilities, or even just kind of really, bringing the sort of retail together with other forms of, what happens if you put a religious building in context with retail or something else? Is that challenging to the perception of this kind of notion of a building having single use? But maybe this kind of hybridity of use is a way of creating new meaning for this architecture.
Also, you have to recognise that in the broader canvas of global discourse, and we are speaking as three academics, there is a degrowth movement. And the degrowth movement does not believe in the idea of endless growth, because endless growth is what got us into a climate crisis to begin with. This constant drive to compare ourselves to other cities. You mentioned Dubai, and obviously, quite understandably, you have your reservations, and as you should, because ecologically it's a catastrophe, to be frank. So I think that there's also a movement that is about recognising that our future is less about creating more and more about protecting what we have. That sustainability means exactly that, sustaining this quality of life as best we can when around us the world will be in chaos, when global trading systems will collapse, when ecologically and environmentally there'll be huge disruptions, when politically there'll be more conflict. These are forecasts not coming from us. These are experts in the field whose research we obviously pay attention to because that's what we do. So we're speaking as three academics. And obviously, as academics, it's our responsibility to listen to experts in our field. And what the experts, and this is global thinking, what many experts are saying is that we need to stop thinking about growth. We need to start thinking about degrowth. And the idea is to stop pursuing the idea of more and more, which we don't need, and being able to sustain what we have. Because what climate collapse represents, what failing global economic systems represent, and what we also understand from our own regional challenges is that we won't be in a position to protect and continue to live in the comfort we have become used to. So that now it's about working more sustainably with what we have by protecting what we have, not constantly expanding what we have and when we don't need to. So that's where we have a systems approach, a shift in thinking, and that's where the discourse is situated.
Yeah, from my disciplinary perspective, in fact, we need to immediately go beyond sustainability, because sustainability really means, at base, how long can this carry on?
Right.
And it can't. So thinking about beyond sustainability to regenerative practice, and we have talked about that in terms of ecology, but I do want to talk about it in terms of social regeneration. I think that's the space in which it's useful to talk about cities, because you've been talking a lot about the city's monuments and big public buildings. But what's been quite dear to our heart, and we've been talking about on arriving here, because we've been driving through the streets, and this building is situated on a street of what I believe are the low-rise Mahala buildings, which is the traditional residential building. And what's interesting, my perspective was, wow, people are still living in the city centre. And of course, we're told that actually a lot of that has already been destroyed. But it seems to me you have a moment here, which is that if I take you to London, 30 years ago, we started destroying communities by bringing what we call gentrification, so that the city centres were repurposed into very high-end living in the old buildings, but for a kind of elite international or high economic group, and the old communities were displaced. And of course, that's a failing. And now we're rethinking that, and they're rethinking it. So it's not going to be regentrification, we're calling it regeneration. And if it's a regeneration project, people get very angry, don't call it gentrification. And the crux there is to be inclusive and to include the existing and local communities in those upgrading of the housing stock. And I think that's what I mean by a regenerative city, where you can have development, but it actually enables the city as it is to flourish rather than just have more.
Yeah, and in a sense, that notion of adaptive reuse that we've all referred to, you know, to reimagine that beyond simply a kind of strategy of intervention, is to actually think about it as a social practice. You know, it's a strategy of taking care, it's a strategy of repair in many ways, but it is a future thinking strategy.
Thank you. Also, I would like to take a moment to remind that on September 26th, first ever Central Asian Urban Forum is going to be held in Uzbekistan. We are really excited. So what do you expect from the forum yourselves?
This conversation is urgent, so I think it's important. The timing is perfect. I think the conversation we've had, I hope what we'll see in the presentations are echoes of some of the points we've made. So not just people talking about growth and expansion. I mean, the simple thing for me, and coming back to this question of infrastructure, and we made the point earlier that it's about the social as well as the kind of material, structural, and also the ecological. I hope there is representation in those panels that consider those three things. I hope there's going to be conversations about adaptive reuse, and something that remembers that cities are for everyone. There shouldn't be any city where cars take preeminence over every other inhabitant, and at the moment, the life of the pedestrian, let's just say, is almost seen as less valuable.
It's
because
precarious.
Cars, we talk about living in a time of precarity. Well, crossing the road in Uzbekistan in general, but certainly in Tashkent, is precarious.
I want to thank each of you for being with us today, for joining us. It was our pleasure. Don't forget to follow Daryo and stay tuned.